In the 4th century before the Common Era, the greatest philosopher of the ancient world sat down and wrote something that has troubled serious thinkers ever since. The man was Plato. The work was a pair of dialogues called Timaeus and Critias, part of the extraordinary body of philosophical writing that established much of the conceptual vocabulary of Western thought. And embedded within those dialogues, told through the mouth of a character named Critias, as he recounts a story passed down through generations from the Athenian statesman Solon, was the specific and detailed account of a place that had not existed for 9,000 years. The place was Atlantis. It lay, Plato wrote, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the great rocky gateway at the western end of the Mediterranean, that we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the opening onto the ocean that the ancient Greeks called simply the sea that had no shore. In this ocean, which we call the Atlantic, there was an island, and the island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which in the geographical understanding of the ancient world meant it was very large indeed. From this island, the seafaring civilization that inhabited it had extended its reach across much of the known world, controlling other islands and reaching as far as the opposite shore of the ocean. The island and its empire were called Atlantis. Plato described it in detail. He described a city of concentric rings, alternating rings of land and water, arranged around a central hill on which sat the palace of the kings and the great temple to the god Poseidon. He described the dimensions of the rings, which were wide enough to accommodate multiple ships side by side. He described the materials of the buildings, walls covered in a metal called orichalcum that shone red in the sunlight, a metal that was second in value only to gold. He described a canal that connected the concentric ring harbor to the outer sea. He described the plain beyond the city, a vast rectangular agricultural plain enclosed by a system of ditches and waterways. He described a population of extraordinary ability and sophistication, builders and engineers and sailors of the first order, who had created in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean a civilization of remarkable power and reach. And then he described how it was destroyed. The Atlanteans, Plato wrote, had been descendants of the god Poseidon himself, the product of a union between the god and a mortal woman on the central hill of their island, and they had for many generations retained the divine character that this origin implied, living with wisdom and virtue and treating each other and the world with the respect that their semi-divine nature required. But over generations, the divine element in their nature was diluted, and the human element grew stronger, and with the human element came the ordinary human failings, greed and ambition, and the desire for power, and the Atlanteans came to be what the corrupting of a great civilization always produces, a people who misused what they had been given, and who turned their power toward domination and conquest. The gods saw this, and the gods acted. In a single day and night of extraordinary violence, the island was destroyed. It sank into the sea. The earth opened and swallowed it, and the ocean covered what remained, and Atlantis was gone. This is the story. This is the account that Plato left, in approximately 360 BC, claimed as historical fact. And the question that has occupied scholars and researchers and the curious since the moment the dialogues were first read, in any context outside the philosophical school where they were written, is the question that still has no resolved answer after 24 centuries of argument. Was Plato describing something real? To understand why the question is so difficult to dismiss, and why it has attracted the sustained attention not only of fringe theorists but of serious historians and geologists and archaeologists across 2 millennia, it is necessary to understand what kind of man Plato was, and what kind of writer he was, and what his relationship to allegory and invention and historical truth was across the body of his work. Plato was born in Athens around 428 BC, a generation after the great Athenian statesman Pericles, in the period when the long war between Athens and Sparta was consuming the city's resources and its confidence in the democratic project that had made Athens the cultural capital of the Greek world. He was a student of Socrates, the great philosopher who taught by conversation rather than by writing, whose method of questioning assumptions to their foundations produced in his students a specific kind of mind, a mind trained to distinguish between what was known and what was assumed, between argument and assertion. When Socrates was tried and executed by Athens in 399 BC for impiety and corrupting the youth, Plato was in his late 20s, and the execution of his teacher marked him profoundly, producing the philosophical school he eventually founded, the Academy, and the extraordinary body of written work that he produced across the following decades, in which the voice of Socrates appears in dialogue after dialogue as the central figure, pursuing the truth through argument. Plato's dialogues are not straightforwardly factual documents. They are philosophical texts, and they use the devices of philosophy, including allegory, thought experiment, and invented scenarios to explore ideas. The famous allegory of the cave, in which prisoners chained in a cave mistake shadows on a wall for reality, is not meant as a description of something that actually happened. The myth of in which a soldier who dies in battle is brought back to life and describes what he has seen in the afterlife, is not meant as reportage. Plato used these inventions deliberately and with full awareness that they were inventions,
Atlantis,
as ways of making
jewel
abstract
of the ancient
ideas
world.
concrete and accessible,
blessed by
as vehicles for philosophical argument rather than as historical claims. And yet Plato repeatedly and explicitly insisted that Atlantis was not an allegory. He had Critias say, in the dialogue that bears his name, that the story was a genuine tradition, genuinely old, truly remarkable, precisely because it was true. The Egyptian priests who had given it to Solon had said the same, that the Greeks had a short cultural memory, that they remembered almost nothing of their deep past because their records had been repeatedly destroyed by catastrophes, and that what the Egyptians preserved in their temples and their records was the account of things that had happened not hundreds, but thousands of years before the conversation in which Solon received them. The insistence on historicity is not peripheral to the Atlantis account in Plato's dialogues. It is central to it. The priests say explicitly that this is not a myth but a record. Classical scholars have argued about this question for as long as the dialogues have existed. The Aristotelian view, attributed to Aristotle, who was Plato's most famous student and who had every reason to know whether his teacher was constructing an allegory, was dismissive. Aristotle is said to have commented that the man who invented Atlantis also destroyed it, suggesting that the island was a philosophical construct of Plato's own making. This view has been the majority scholarly position across most of the subsequent history of classical scholarship. Atlantis was a philosophical allegory, possibly drawing on vague memories of historical civilizations like Minoan Crete, or on the political rhetoric of Plato's own Athens, but not a description of a real place that had existed in the geological past. The minority scholarly position, which has never disappeared entirely from the academic literature and which has been bolstered by a series of geological and archaeological discoveries in the 20th and 21st centuries, holds that to dismiss Plato's insistence on historicity so quickly is to misread both the dialogues and the historical context in which they were written. Plato was not a careless writer. He was, in fact, among the most precise and most careful writers in the ancient tradition, someone who chose every word with specific intentions. If he wanted to write an allegory, he knew how to write an allegory. If he wanted to write history, he said it was history. The Atlantis account is presented as history. The question is whether it is. What would the world have looked like 9,000 years before Plato? the period the Egyptian priests pointed to as the time of Atlantis? The answer to this question, which was unavailable to scholars and thinkers who lived before the development of modern geological and archaeological science, are now one of the most scientifically active areas of human investigation, and what it reveals about the state of the world in that period is considerably more dramatic than the conventional picture of a world inhabited entirely by primitive hunter-gatherers living in small, simple communities. The date that Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis, calculated by the 9,000 years that the Egyptian priests said had elapsed since the events they were describing, places the destruction at approximately 9,600 BC. The coincidence, if it is a coincidence, between this date and one of the most dramatic environmental transitions in the history of the Earth is something that every serious examination of the Atlantis question has to grapple with. The last ice age, technically the last glacial maximum, reached its peak approximately 21,000 years ago, at a time when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and the sea level was roughly 130 meters lower than it is today. The land area of the Earth was therefore significantly greater than it is in the present, with vast continental shelves exposed that are now submerged, connecting what we now see as separate land masses and providing habitable coastline and lowland areas that no longer exist. The Ice Age did not end instantaneously. It ended across a period of thousands of years, with significant fluctuations, producing a world of accelerating change that challenged every form of life that had adapted to Ice Age conditions. The period between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years ago is known in geological science as the Younger Dryas. It was a period of abrupt, dramatic climate reversal, a sudden return to near Ice Age conditions after a period of warming, followed by an equally abrupt return to warming at the end of the Younger Dryas period. The Younger Dryas appears in the geological record as a sudden, sharp signal, a boundary layer that marks a dramatic discontinuity in the gradual warming that was ending the Ice Age. It appears not just in ice cores from Greenland, where it was first identified, but in sediment cores, cave formations, tree rings, and geological deposits around the world, a global event of sufficient magnitude to leave its signature in every archive of the past that scientists have learned to read. What caused the Younger Dryas? This is where the science becomes both more certain and more dramatic than it was even a decade ago. The dominant hypothesis in the current scientific literature, the hypothesis that has survived the most rigorous testing and that continues to accumulate supporting evidence in geological record after geological record, is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This hypothesis proposes that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic event, the explosion or fragmentation of a comet or asteroid in the Earth's atmosphere, which deposited material across a large portion of the northern hemisphere, triggered catastrophic wildfires, caused massive floods from the melting of ice sheets, and ultimately produced the abrupt climate cooling and reversal that the geological record shows. The evidence for the impact hypothesis includes specific markers, platinum group elements, and nanodiamonds deposited in a thin layer that appears in geological formations dated to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, across sites from North America through Europe to the Middle East. Spherical carbon particles and siliceous scoria formed by high-temperature events. Evidence of massive wildfires burning simultaneously across enormous areas. The impact winter hypothesis, by which the deposition of material in the atmosphere would have caused a rapid global cooling, is consistent with the abrupt temperature drop that the geological record shows. The implications of this for the Atlantis question are significant. If the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact, or series of impacts around 12,900 years ago, the events of that period would have been catastrophic in ways that the geological record preserves, and that any civilization existing at the time would have experienced as a world-ending event. The sea levels that were already rising as the Ice Age ended would have received an additional pulse of meltwater from the sudden melting of ice triggered by the wildfires and the heat of the impact, dramatically accelerating the flooding of coastal areas. The cultural and material record of any coastal civilization existing at the time would have been destroyed, submerged under the rising waters, and buried under the sediment of thousands of years of subsequent geological change. The date does not match precisely. The Younger Dryas began approximately 12,900 years ago, and Plato's date for Atlantis is approximately 11,600 years ago, when the Younger Dryas ended. But the uncertainty in the timing of oral traditions preserved across multiple cultural transmissions over thousands of years before being written down is substantial, and a margin of a few centuries or even a few thousand years in a tradition preserved across nearly 12 millennia is exactly what one would expect. The point of the date is not its precision, but its order of magnitude. Nays is a story about something that happened at roughly the boundary of the Ice Age and the current geological period, which is precisely the boundary that produced the most dramatic environmental transformation in human experience. It is in this geological and climatic context that one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 20th century must be understood, a discovery that has forced a fundamental revision of what we thought we knew about human civilization in this period. Göbekli Tepe is a site in the Şanlıurfa region of southeastern Turkey, in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, discovered by a Kurdish shepherd in 1963 and excavated in earnest beginning in 1994 under the direction of the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. What Schmidt and his team found over the following decades of excavation has not stopped challenging the conventional understanding of human prehistory since the moment the first stones were exposed. Göbekli Tepe is a series of circular enclosures, the oldest of which date to approximately 12,000 years ago, around 10,000 BC. Each enclosure consists of massive T-shaped stone pillars, some of them more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circles with a central pair of larger pillars, their flat tops facing each other, across the enclosed space. The pillars are carved with elaborate and accomplished relief sculpture, predatory animals, including lions and bulls and foxes and vultures, abstract symbols, human hands and arms reaching down the length of the pillar toward carved belts. The carving is not crude. It is not the work of people at the beginning of a cultural tradition, fumbling with unfamiliar tools. It is the work of people who had fully developed an aesthetic tradition, a symbolic vocabulary, a set of technical skills in stone carving and stone working that represents the product of significant accumulated practice. The people who built Göbekli Tepe are classified, in the conventional archaeological timeline, as hunter-gatherers. People classification is based on the absence, at the Göbekli Tepe period, of the domesticated plants and animals that are conventionally used to mark the transition to settled agricultural civilization. The conventional model of human development places the agricultural revolution approximately 10,000 years ago, slightly later than the oldest layers at Göbekli Tepe, and it describes the agricultural revolution as the enabling event for the development of complex, organized society, the transition that made possible the surplus, the settlement, the specialization of labor, and the accumulation of material culture that we associate with civilization. Göbekli Tepe does not fit this model. The structures at Göbekli Tepe require, by any reasonable analysis, a level of social organization, labor specialization, and coordinated effort that the conventional model of hunter-gatherer society does not accommodate. Quarrying 20-ton stones, transporting them over significant distances, erecting them with precision, and then carving them with accomplished artistry does not happen without organization, without planning, without the ability to sustain a workforce engaged in non-subsistence activity for extended periods. It requires surplus, whether that surplus came from agriculture, from intensive foraging, from the management of wild herds, or from some combination of these that the archaeological record has not yet fully illuminated. And there is another feature of Göbekli Tepe that is even more extraordinary than its existence. It was deliberately buried. At some point after each set of enclosures was completed, the enclosures were filled in, systematically and deliberately, with rubble including animal bones and worked stone. The site was closed and covered. New enclosures were built on top of the old ones, and they too were filled in and covered, producing the tell, the artificial hill, that the Kurdish shepherd found in 1963. Klaus Schmidt famously said that Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement but a sanctuary, a place of religious or ritual significance that communities came to from the surrounding landscape, and that was not their permanent home. He spent years arguing that it changed everything we thought we knew about the relationship between social complexity and agriculture, about which came first, about how human civilization actually developed. Schmidt died in 2014, before the full implications of his work had been absorbed by the field, and the excavations have continued under other directors. Less than 5% of the site has been excavated. The full extent of what lies beneath the hill at Göbekli Tepe, in terms of the number and the character of the enclosures and the time span of the site's use, remains largely unknown. What is known is sufficient to establish that organized, sophisticated, symbolically complex human activity was occurring in this region at a date that the conventional model of human development said should not have been possible. If people could organize the construction of Göbekli Tepe in 10,000 BC, what else were they doing? This is the question that the discovery of Göbekli Tepe opens, and it is a question that the conventional model of human prehistory has not yet fully absorbed or answered. The specific nature of the organization required for Göbekli Tepe suggests that the people of that period were not the simple small band foragers of the conventional model, but were capable of social coordination at a scale and over time scales that the conventional model did not predict. If they were capable of this, at this site, in this region, what were people doing in other regions, including the vast coastal areas that are now underwater? Now, in earnest, we can begin to examine the specific location theories for Atlantis, the serious attempts by serious researchers to identify the specific place that Plato was describing. The theory that has received the most mainstream archaeological attention and that represents the most respectable scholarly attempt to identify a historical basis for Plato's account is the Santorini hypothesis, also called the Minoan hypothesis. Santorini, now a spectacular crescent of volcanic islands in the Aegean Sea and one of the most visited destinations in Greece, was once a single, larger island known in antiquity as Thera. Around 1620 BC, give or take a few decades, depending on which dating method is used, the island of Thera underwent one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in the history of the Holocene epoch, the geological period we currently inhabit. The eruption was catastrophic on a scale that is difficult to fully appreciate. It is estimated to have been 4 or 5 times more powerful than the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, itself one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history. It ejected cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, triggering climate disruption across a significant portion of the northern hemisphere. It generated tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. It destroyed the Minoan settlement on Thera entirely, burying it under meters of volcanic ash that preserved its buildings with extraordinary completeness. The Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete but with settlements and trading relationships across the Aegean world, was sophisticated and accomplished by any measure, producing elaborate palace architecture, advanced plumbing systems, distinctive and beautiful art, and a trade network that reached from Egypt to the western Mediterranean. The eruption of Thera is believed by many archaeologists to have contributed significantly to the decline and eventual collapse of Minoan civilization, though the precise mechanism of the collapse remains debated. The parallel between this account and the Atlantis story is obvious and was first proposed in the 1960s by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos and subsequently developed by various researchers. An island civilization in the Aegean or Mediterranean, sophisticated and powerful, destroyed by a volcanic catastrophe that caused the island to partially collapse into the sea, its settlement buried, and its civilization disrupted. The physical evidence at Akrotiri, the preserved Minoan settlement on Thera, shows a prosperous and sophisticated community that appears to have been evacuated before the final eruption, its buildings intact and filled with the ordinary objects of a functioning society. The Santorini hypothesis has significant problems, however, and those problems have been acknowledged by its proponents even as they have advanced the theory. The most fundamental problem is the date. Plato gives the destruction of Atlantis as occurring 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, which places it around 9,600 BC. The Thera eruption occurred around 1,620 BC. The difference is not 900 years, which might be attributed to a copying error or a misremembering in the oral tradition. It is 8,000 years. This is not a discrepancy that can be attributed to the imprecision of ancient number systems or the degradation of oral tradition. It is a discrepancy of an order of magnitude. The proponents of the Santorini hypothesis have argued that Plato's numbers may have been transmitted in an early form of shorthand in which hundreds were written similarly to thousands, producing a factor of 10 error that would transform 900 years into 9,000 years. This is possible, and it would have the additional benefit of placing the event within the period of Minoan civilization, which is historically documented and archaeologically verified. But the argument requires a specific kind of transcriptional error for which there is no direct evidence, and it requires dismissing Plato's explicit and repeated insistence on the antiquity of the tradition as either an error or an invention. The Antarctic hypothesis for Atlantis has a very different origin and a very different character. It was developed in the 1950s by an American professor named Charles Hapgood, who proposed a theory of Earth crust displacement, the idea that the entire outer shell of the Earth had, at some point in the relatively recent geological past, shifted as a unit over the underlying mantle, moving land masses to different latitudes with dramatic climatic consequences. Hapgood applied this theory to Antarctica, proposing that the continent, now under ice at the South Pole, had previously been in a more temperate latitude and had supported a habitable land surface and potentially human civilization, and that the crust displacement had moved it to its current position, covering it in ice. This theory has fundamental problems with the physics of the Earth. The mechanism by which an Earth crust displacement of the magnitude Hapgood proposed would occur is not supported by current understanding of plate tectonics, and the geological evidence for such a displacement in the relevant period does not exist. The ice cores drilled from Antarctica show no evidence of a period of relative warmth and habitability in the time frame that Hapgood's theory requires. The Antarctic hypothesis remains firmly outside mainstream geological science and requires the rejection of much of what has been learned about the Earth's crustal dynamics in the century of geological investigation since plate tectonic theory was developed. The Azores and mid-Atlantic ridge theories place Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, where Plato said it was, and identify the existing Atlantic island groups, including the Azores, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde archipelago, as the remnants of a larger landmass that was partially submerged. The geological reality of the mid-Atlantic ridge, the underwater mountain range that runs the length of the Atlantic and that marks the boundary between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates, is sometimes invoked in support of a mid-Atlantic landmass, the idea being that the ridge represents a once higher feature that has subsided. The geological record of the Atlantic does not support the existence of a large continental landmass in the Atlantic that sank in the relevant period. The Azores and other Atlantic island groups are volcanic islands produced by hotspot activity, not remnants of a sunken continent. The mechanisms by which a continent the size of Plato's Atlantis could sink into the Atlantic within a human historical timeframe are not supported by the known rates of geological change, which operate over millions rather than thousands of years. This does not rule out the existence of inhabited Atlantic islands that were submerged by sea level rise, which is a different and more geologically plausible mechanism, but it does argue against the dramatic, rapid submergence of a continental-scale landmass. The Bimini Road is an underwater feature off the coast of the Bahamas, a series of large, flat limestone blocks arranged in what appears to be a regular pattern on the sea floor in shallow water. It was discovered in 1968 by divers near North Bimini and became immediately and controversially associated with Atlantis, partly because the founder of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, Edgar Cayce, had prophesied in 1940 that evidence of Atlantis would be found in the waters near Bimini around that time. The alignment of a discovery with a specific prophecy made by a figure whose influence in the world of Atlantis research has been both significant and problematic was seized upon by enthusiasts as confirmation of the prophecy and of Atlantis. The geological analysis of the Bimini Road has been conducted by multiple researchers and has produced, with reasonable consistency, a conclusion that the formation is natural, a fracture pattern in beach rock, the kind of limestone formation produced by the carbonate-rich sediment of tropical beaches, which forms in flat layers and fractures along regular lines, producing the rectangular blocks that superficially resemble dressed stone. Beach rock formations of this type are common in the Caribbean and in tropical coastal environments around the world, and their distinctive fracture patterns have been mistaken for man-made structures at other sites as well. The evidence that the Bimini Road is a man-made structure is not compelling, and the geological explanation is straightforward and well supported. The Richat structure is different. It is different in the specific way that makes it, of all the location theories, the one that demands the most serious attention from anyone who approaches the question with genuine curiosity rather than with a predetermined conclusion. The Richat structure is a geological formation in the Sahara Desert of Mauritania, in West Africa, approximately 50 kilometers in diameter, visible from space and sufficiently distinctive to serve as a landmark for orbiting spacecraft. It consists of concentric rings of rock, alternating bands of elevated terrain and lower terrain, arranged around a roughly circular central area. The resemblance to Plato's description of Atlantis is striking. Plato described a city of concentric rings of land and water, alternating. The Richat structure is concentric rings of elevated and lower terrain, alternating. The diameter of the structure, approximately 50 kilometers, is in the range that Plato's dimensions, interpreted in ancient Greek units, would produce for the outer extent of Atlantis. The structure sits in what is now desert, but was, in the period of the early Holocene, a significantly wetter and more habitable landscape, when the Sahara Green period produced grasslands and lakes and rivers across what is now among the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. There is a river nearby, the Atlantis Saheli, which would in the Sahara Green period have provided access to the Atlantic Ocean. The elevation of the Richat structure, which is approximately 100 meters above the surrounding plain, is consistent with Plato's description of a structure that stood on elevated terrain. The geology of the structure, which has been interpreted by some researchers as consistent with a marine sediment environment in the relevant period, is another point of consistency with the idea of a coastal or near-coastal location. The Richat hypothesis has been developed in recent years primarily by the amateur researchers and YouTube documentarians who constitute a significant portion of the current Atlantis investigative community, and this origin has led to its being somewhat dismissed by mainstream archaeology. But the geographical and dimensional correspondences between the Richat structure and Plato's description are genuine and deserve serious evaluation, not on the basis of the enthusiasm of its advocates, but on the basis of the facts of the structure itself and the facts of Plato's account. The mainstream geological interpretation of the Richat structure is that it is an eroded geologic dome, an uplifted circular structure whose layered rocks were exposed by erosion over millions of years, which would make it far older than any human civilization, and would make the coincidence of its resemblance to Plato's description exactly that, a coincidence. The problem with this dismissal is that coincidences of this specificity, of this dimensional precision, and this configurational match deserve careful consideration rather than reflexive dismissal. The history of archaeology is full of cases where genuine human structures were initially attributed to natural causes because the scale or the date of the structures did not fit the conventional understanding of what human beings had been doing at that time. Göbekli Tepe itself was initially interpreted as a medieval cemetery before excavation revealed its true character and age. Now we need to move to a different category of evidence, one that does not depend on identifying a specific physical location for Atlantis, but that bears on the broader question of whether a sophisticated civilization could have existed in the period that Plato's account describes. The flood myths are among the most widely distributed and most internally consistent sets of mythological narratives in human culture. They exist across virtually every human culture that has preserved any mythological record, from the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical flood narrative, and which describes a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, survived by a specific individual who builds a boat and survives the inundation, to the Hindu tradition of Manu, who receives warning of the coming flood and builds a boat to survive it, to the flood traditions of the Pacific Islands, the Americas, and Central Africa. The structural similarities between these traditions, the flood sent as divine punishment or simply as divine will, the surviving human who is warned in advance and who preserves the continuity of human life and human knowledge through the inundation, the world that is different after the flood than it was before, appear across cultures that are separated by vast oceans and that did not, as far as the historical record shows, have contact with each other in the period when these traditions. The conventional explanation for this distribution is that floods are universal human experiences and that flood myths arise independently in every culture from the local experience of flooding, whether river floods, coastal flooding, or local inundations. This explanation accounts for some of the flood traditions, particularly those from cultures in river valleys or on coastlines where flooding was a regular feature of life. but it does not comfortably account for the specific structural similarities between traditions from unconnected cultures, the specific detail of advance warning, the preservation of knowledge and life in a boat or elevated refuge, the divine causation, the transformed post-flood world. An alternative explanation, which is not proven, but which is not unreasonable as a hypothesis, is that the flood traditions preserve a memory of the actual catastrophic inundation of the end of the last ice age, the worldwide sea level rise that put hundreds of feet of water over coastal areas that had been inhabited for thousands of years. If human communities living on the coasts that were submerged were sophisticated enough to preserve oral traditions, and if those traditions were passed down through the cultures that survived the inundation into the interior, then the consistency of the flood myths across unconnected cultures would be explained not by parallel independent invention, but by the preservation of a single, actual, globally experienced event. This hypothesis requires that the coastal civilizations of the Ice Age were sophisticated enough to produce traditions durable enough to survive 12,000 years of transmission. It requires that the traditions were sufficiently important to their bearers to be maintained and transmitted across that enormous span of time. It requires, in other words, exactly the kind of prehistoric sophistication that Göbekli Tepe has shown us was real. Graham Hancock is the researcher who has done the most to bring these threads together for a general audience, and his work requires careful assessment because it has been both influential and controversial in ways that make it difficult to discuss without triggering either the enthusiasm of his supporters or the reflexive dismissal of his critics, neither of which is a useful response to the evidence. Hancock's most important books, Fingerprints of the Gods published in 1995 and Magicians of the Gods published in 2015, assembled a large body of evidence from geology, archaeology, mythology, and astronomy, and argued for the existence of a sophisticated prehistoric civilization that was destroyed by the catastrophic events of the Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,000 years ago. The evidentiary quality of Hancock's work is uneven, as is acknowledged by the mainstream archaeologists who have engaged with it seriously, rather than dismissing it entirely. Some of his arguments are genuinely compelling, particularly those relating to the geological evidence for the Younger Dryas impact and the implications of Göbekli Tepe. Others are weaker, particularly those that rely on astronomical alignments or on the interpretation of mythological traditions in ways that are more selective than the evidence warrants. The mainstream archaeology establishment's response to Hancock has often been more hostile than his best arguments deserve, shaped by the association of his work with fringe theories and New Age sensationalism that has characterized some of the popular interest in his ideas. The reality is that Hancock's most important contribution, the sustained argument that the conventional model of human prehistory requires serious revision in the light of the geological and archaeological evidence for sophisticated human activity before the conventional timeline, has been substantially supported by the research of the scientific mainstream in the years since his first books were published. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which Hancock championed, has gained significant scientific credibility and is now supported by multiple peer-reviewed papers in major geological and archaeological journals. The evidence for human activity at Göbekli Tepe, which Hancock wrote about extensively, has continued to accumulate and to push back the accepted timeline of human sophistication in exactly the direction his argument required. Randall Carlson, a geologist and researcher who has collaborated with Hancock and who has contributed a significant body of his own research on the Younger Dryas and its impacts, has added geological rigor to the argument about what the Younger Dryas event would have done to the human world. Carlson's specific focus on the geological evidence for catastrophic flooding produced by the rapid melting of the Laurentide ice sheet, the enormous ice mass that covered North America during the last ice age, and the specific geological features of the North American landscape that bear the signature of those floods, provides a concrete physical picture of the catastrophic conditions that would have prevailed in the period of the Younger Dryas transition. The Missoula floods, for example, are a well-documented geological event. The repeated catastrophic drainage of glacial Lake Missoula, a vast ice age lake dammed by a lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet in what is now Montana, which released floods of extraordinary violence, carrying icebergs and boulders across the landscape of what is now the Pacific Northwest, at speeds and volumes that dwarf any historical flood experience. The channeled scablands of Washington state, a landscape carved by these floods into a system of dry channels and basalt features that has no parallel in the modern world, are physical testimony to the scale of what happened. Carlson's contribution has been to document these geological signatures with rigor and to connect them to the broader picture of catastrophic change at the end of the Ice Age. The underwater archaeology evidence has begun, slowly and incompletely, to provide direct physical evidence of what existed in the coastal areas that are now submerged. The Gulf of Kambat, off the coast of Gujarat in northwestern India, was investigated by the National Institute of Ocean Technology in 2001 and was found to contain underwater features that some researchers have interpreted as man-made structures, including what appeared to be the remains of buildings and artifacts, including carved stone and pottery. The government of India took the discoveries seriously enough to initiate further investigation, and the dating of materials recovered from the area suggests the site may date to approximately 7,500 to 9,000 years ago, when the Gulf of Kambat was a river valley, before sea level rise flooded it. The interpretation of the Kambat findings is contested. Some researchers see them as compelling evidence of an early, sophisticated civilization on the Indian subcontinent, a civilization that would predate the Indus Valley civilization by several thousand years. Others are more cautious, noting that the evidence from sonar and dredging operations is difficult to interpret definitively, and that what appears to be artificial structure may prove to be natural formation when examined more carefully. The full underwater archaeological investigation required to resolve the question has not been conducted. The Yonaguni Monument is an underwater rock formation off the southern coast of Japan, discovered by divers in 1986, consisting of massive, flat-topped terraced platforms of rock that have the superficial appearance of a stepped pyramid or a stepped ceremonial platform with what appear to be right-angle cuts, parallel walls, and a variety of other features that some observers have interpreted as man-made. The geological debate about Yonaguni has been sustained and has not fully resolved. Japanese geologist Masaaki Kimura, who has studied the formation extensively, argues that the features are man-made and represent a submerged structure from a period when the site was above water, approximately 8,000 years ago. Other geologists argue that the regular features can be explained by the natural fracturing of the local sandstone, which contains extensive bedding planes and joint systems that produce rectangular features naturally. The significance of these underwater sites is not that any single one of them proves the existence of a prehistoric civilization comparable to Plato's Atlantis. They are individually ambiguous and individually insufficient as evidence for any strong conclusion. Their significance is rather that they collectively illustrate the potential of underwater archaeology in the areas submerged by sea level rise since the last ice age, and the paucity of investigation that has been conducted in those areas compared to the investigation conducted on land. The numbers involved are extraordinary. At the last glacial maximum, 21,000 years ago, the shoreline of every continent was located approximately 130 meters lower than the current shoreline. The continental shelves that are now submerged were then exposed land. The total area of land that was above water at the last glacial maximum and is now submerged is approximately 27 million square kilometers, roughly the combined area of South America and Australia. This is not a marginal amount of land. It is a vast expanse of the planet's surface, and it included many of the most attractive locations for human habitation: coastal plains with access to marine resources, river valleys opening onto the sea, sheltered bays and inlets in the most productive latitude bands for human occupation. The archaeological investigation of this submerged land has barely begun. The technology for systematic underwater archaeological survey at the depths and over the distances involved is still developing. The majority of the continental shelf areas that were habitable at the last glacial maximum have received no systematic archaeological investigation whatsoever. We have barely looked. The question of what we will find when we do look is genuinely open, and it is one of the most exciting questions in the entire field of human prehistory. In this context, the Atlantis question becomes something different from what it typically appears to be in popular culture. It is not, or not primarily, a question about a specific island with a specific design of concentric rings in the Atlantic Ocean. It is a question about the state of human civilization in the period before the catastrophic environmental transition of the Younger Dryas and the subsequent sea level rise, about what existed in the vast areas now underwater, and about whether the cultural memory of that world, preserved imperfectly through thousands of years of oral tradition and finally written down in Plato's dialogues, contains a historical core. The geological reality is clear. The sea did rise. The land that is now underwater was inhabited. The people who lived on it were more sophisticated than the conventional model of pre-agricultural humanity suggested they should be. The events of the Younger Dryas, which the growing evidence for the impact hypothesis describes as a cosmic catastrophe of the first order, would have been experienced as the end of the world by any civilization that existed at the time, and the survivors would have carried what they remembered into a world profoundly changed from the one they had known, a world in which the coastlines they knew were underwater, the cities they had built were drowned, and the only record of what had been was what they carried in their memories and in their traditions. This is not proof that Atlantis was real. The specific details of Plato's account, the concentric rings, the orichalcum, the naval empire, may be embellishments added across the millennia of transmission, may be the work of Plato himself, dressing a real memory in the narrative clothing of a philosophical argument about the corrupting effect of power. But the underlying question, whether there was a sophisticated coastal civilization in the period Plato described that was destroyed by catastrophic environmental change, is not a question that the evidence permits us to dismiss. The academic mainstream's dismissal of the Atlantis question, which has been the default position for most of the past century, reflects a reasonable skepticism about the more extreme claims that have been made in the Atlantis' name, including the claims of psychic Edgar Cayce and the numerous New Age elaborations of the myth that have little connection to either Plato's text or the archaeological and geological evidence. But the dismissal has too often extended to the genuine and serious questions that the geological and archaeological evidence supports, and the specific discoveries of the past 3 decades, from Göbekli Tepe to the growing case for the Younger Dryas impact, have made that blanket dismissal harder to sustain than it was. The mythological convergence across unconnected cultures, the specific consistency of the flood tradition, the sudden appearance of sophisticated architectural, religious, and social organization at Göbekli Tepe before the agricultural revolution, the geological evidence for catastrophic events at the boundary between the Ice Age and the present, the vast extent of now submerged coastal land that we have never archaeologically investigated, all of these constitute not a proof of Atlantis, but a serious case for the proposition that something significant existed before the conventional timeline of human civilization and was destroyed or disrupted by the events of approximately 12,000 years ago. The ocean holds what the ocean has always held, the record of the world as it was before the waters rose. The continental shelves, the drowned river valleys, the submerged coastlines, the underwater plains that were once inhabited land, are archives of a past that we are only beginning to learn how to read. The technology of underwater survey and excavation is improving rapidly. The mapping of the seafloor is proceeding, driven by the same satellite and remote sensing technology that has transformed our ability to understand the land surface. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe has fundamentally altered the conventional account of human prehistory and has opened the question of what other extraordinary things we do not yet know about the people who lived before recorded history. Plato wrote 2,400 years ago that beyond the Pillars of Hercules there had once been an island and a civilization and a catastrophe. He wrote it as history. He insisted it was history. He placed it at a time that corresponds to the most dramatic environmental transition in human experience, a time when the coast of every continent was being drowned by rising seas, and when the cosmic event hypothesized by the Younger Dryas impact theory was, according to the growing body of geological evidence, raining catastrophe on a human world that was more sophisticated than the conventional account had allowed. Whether Plato was describing a specific place that a future generation will find beneath the ocean, or whether he was giving philosophical clothing to a genuine cultural memory of the catastrophic world change of the Younger Dryas, or whether he invented Atlantis entirely, and the correspondences between his account and the actual geology and archaeology of the prehistoric world are coincidences, we do not know. The honest answer to the Atlantis question, the answer that the accumulated evidence of 2,000 years of investigation actually supports, is not that Atlantis is real and not that it is fiction. It is that the world that existed before the end of the last ice age was more complicated and more sophisticated than we have known, that the events of 12,000 years ago were more catastrophic than we have appreciated, and that the vast areas of the world's surface that were inhabited before the sea level rise and are now under hundreds of feet of water have barely been looked at. The question of what we will find when we look properly is genuinely open, on the possibility that some of what we find will correspond to what Plato described, however imperfectly and however much the specific details may have been elaborated in the transmission, is a possibility that the geological and archaeological evidence gives us no reason to rule out. The ocean is the archive. The archive is largely unread. The reading has barely begun, and somewhere in the depths, in the drowned coastal plains and submerged river valleys and flooded continental shelves of a world that was above water 12,000 years ago, the answer to the Atlantis question may already exist. The question is not whether we will eventually find it. The question is whether, when we do, we will recognize it for what it is. The waters covered the world. Something existed before they rose. The memory of it survives in myths and in stone circles, and in the words of a Greek philosopher who insisted, for reasons we do not fully understand, that what he was telling his readers was not an allegory, but the truth. We have only begun to look. The specific details of Plato's account deserve more sustained attention than even the serious literature on Atlantis typically gives them, because the precision of the details is itself one of the most interesting features of the text. Plato did not simply describe a powerful island nation in the ocean. He described a specific architectural plan, a specific geography, a specific set of dimensions, and a specific sequence of events, with a specificity that is unusual in ancient descriptions of legendary or mythological places. Consider the description of the architecture of the city. Plato describes an outer city surrounded by a wall that shone with the gleam of orichalcum, a metal that he identifies as having been mined in the island and that he describes as shining red like fire, more valuable than any metal except gold. He describes the wall of the harbor as coated with tin and the outer wall as coated with brass and the inner wall of the royal precinct as coated with orichalcum itself. He describes the palace roof as made of solid ivory and gold and silver and orichalcum. He describes the great temple to Poseidon as gilded with silver on the exterior, with pinnacles of gold, the interior gold throughout with silver and gold and ivory, and the statue of the god himself as large enough that its head touched the roof. This level of material detail is not the language of allegory. Allegories describe the essentials of a situation and rely on the reader to understand the symbolic register being employed. They do not describe which metal was used on which wall of which precinct. This is the language of someone describing something remembered, however imperfectly, or something documented, however far removed the documentation is from the original. The dimensions that Plato gives are equally specific. The circular harbor at the center of the city had a diameter of approximately a stadium, which in ancient Greek measurement was approximately 600 feet, or roughly 180 meters. The ring of water surrounding the central island was approximately a stadium in width. The next ring of land was 2 stadia in width, then a ring of water 3 stadia in width, then another ring of land 4 stadia wide, then another ring of water 5 stadia wide. These numbers have been compared by researchers to the Richat structure and to other proposed sites, and the correspondence of the basic proportional scheme to the concentric ring structure at the Richat structure has been noted as a genuine point of interest even by researchers who are skeptical of the Richat hypothesis as a whole. The description of the plain that lay inland from the city is also specific. Plato describes a rectangular plain, 3,000 stadia long and 2,000 stadia wide, surrounded by a system of channels and irrigation ditches, capable of supporting a large agricultural population. He describes the military capabilities of the empire, the numbers of war chariots and soldiers and horses and ships that the various divisions of the empire could supply. He describes the system of government, the 10 kings descended from Poseidon's 10 sons, ruling different portions of the empire according to a specific constitutional arrangement. None of this is the texture of a philosophical allegory. The allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic describes prisoners, chains, a fire, shadows on a wall. It does not specify the dimensions of the cave or the material of the chains or the brightness of the fire in specific quantifiable units. When Plato is writing allegory, he writes allegory. When he is writing the Atlantis account, he writes with the specificity of someone who believes he is recording actual historical facts. The Egyptian priests who gave the account to Solon, as reported by Critias in Plato's dialogue, identified themselves as custodians of a historical record that went back much further than the Greek cultural memory. They said explicitly that the Greeks were like children compared to the Egyptians in terms of the antiquity of their knowledge, that every few generations some catastrophe, flood or fire or other great destruction destroyed the human memory of the past, and that the Egyptians alone had preserved through their written records the account of what had happened in the ages before the catastrophe struck. They had records, they said, of civilizations and events going back 8,000 years from Solon's visit, which itself took place in approximately 600 BC, and they described the Athenian state of 9,000 years before that as a great power that had resisted the expansionism of Atlantis. The figure of Solon in the Atlantis tradition is itself historically significant. Solon was a real historical person, the great Athenian lawgiver who had reformed the Athenian constitution in the early 6th century BC, and who had traveled to Egypt as part of a broader period of intellectual exploration. He is one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, a figure whose historicity is not in question. If Plato simply invented the Atlantis story, the choice to attribute it through Solon, a well-documented historical figure, to Egyptian priests, who would have been the most credible possible custodians of ancient knowledge in the ancient world, suggests a deliberate strategy of lending credibility to the account. But if the story was genuinely transmitted from Solon, who genuinely heard it from Egyptian priests, the choice of Solon as the source is simply the historical record of how the account arrived in Athens. The Sais temple complex in Egypt, where Solon reportedly received the account, was a real place, the great temple to the goddess Neith, in the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, a center of Egyptian religious and scholarly life. It is at least historically possible that the temple maintained records of extreme antiquity, as the priests claimed. Egyptian civilization had been engaged in systematic record-keeping for more than 2,000 years before Solon's visit. The specific claims made by the priests about the Egyptian record-keeping tradition are not implausible in the context of what we know about Egyptian scribal culture and the importance that Egyptian religious institutions placed on the preservation of historical knowledge. The astronomical context of the Atlantis account has attracted attention from researchers who have noted that the period of approximately 10,000 BC falls at a significant juncture in the astronomical cycle known as the precession of the equinoxes, the very slow rotation of the Earth's axis that produces a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, in which the orientation of the Earth relative to the stars changes gradually and then returns to its starting point. Various researchers have argued that the astronomical knowledge of advanced prehistoric cultures was encoded in the alignments and orientations of major archaeological sites, including Göbekli Tepe and the Egyptian monuments at Giza, and that this knowledge points to a cultural tradition of astronomical observation extending back to the period that Plato describes. The astronomical alignment arguments are among the more contested aspects of the alternative archaeology tradition, requiring careful discrimination between genuine astronomical significances and the pattern-finding tendency of the human mind applied to the enormous dataset of potential alignments among ancient structures. Some of the alignment arguments are genuinely compelling, based on rigorous mathematical analysis and on alignments that have been independently verified by multiple researchers. Others are less so, relying on selective choices among the available data and on precision claims that the available evidence does not support. What is not contested is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe and who were engaged in sophisticated social and cultural activity across the period of the Younger Dryas and its aftermath were observing the sky. The ability to predict the movements of celestial bodies, to track the positions of stars and planets, and the cycles of the moon, requires sustained observation and a tradition of recording and comparing observations across generations. It requires, in other words, exactly the kind of sophisticated social organization and cultural continuity that the existence of Göbekli Tepe demonstrates was possible. If people could build Göbekli Tepe, they could observe and record the movements of the stars, and if they could observe and record the movements of the stars, they could develop the kind of astronomical knowledge that some of the alignment researchers describe. The carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe include, on what is called the Vulture Stone, Pillar 43, a carved image of what some researchers have interpreted as a representation of a specific astronomical configuration, the position of the sky as seen from Göbekli Tepe at a specific date in the past. The interpretation is not universally accepted, but it has been taken seriously enough by at least one group of mainstream researchers who published their analysis in the peer-reviewed Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry Journal in 2017 to constitute a real contribution to the discussion of astronomical knowledge at Göbekli Tepe. Whether or not the specific astronomical interpretations are correct, the existence of Göbekli Tepe forces the question of what else was happening in the human world at that time. The site in Turkey is extraordinary, not only because it exists, but because it implies the existence of a broader context, a cultural and social world capable of producing this kind of effort, this level of organization, this degree of symbolic sophistication. That context has not been found, or rather, has only been found in fragments. The fragments include Göbekli Tepe itself, other Neolithic sites in the region that are also pushing back the timeline of social complexity, and the various underwater sites around the world that hint at what the drowned coastal areas might contain. The concept of a pre-agricultural civilization of significant sophistication has been resisted by mainstream archaeology, partly because it conflicts with a fundamental narrative of human progress. The idea that civilization is a product of the agricultural revolution, that the surplus food produced by farming is what enabled the specialization of labor and the development of social complexity that eventually produced cities and writing and the other features of civilization as conventionally defined. Göbekli Tepe challenges this narrative by showing that social complexity and organized architectural effort preceded the agricultural revolution, not followed from it. The conventional model may in fact have the causation backwards. Perhaps it was the social complexity, the organized communities capable of large-scale collective effort that enabled and drove the agricultural revolution, rather than the other way around. If pre-agricultural social complexity of the kind demonstrated by Göbekli Tepe was possible in southeastern Turkey, it was potentially possible in other locations and other periods. The specific locations that were most attractive for human habitation in the Ice Age, and in the period of transition between the Ice Age and the current period, would have been coastal. The continental shelves provided flat, resource-rich land with access to the sea, the most productive foraging environment available. The population density of coastal areas in that period may have been significantly higher than the population density of inland areas, which would mean that the most sophisticated cultures of the period were concentrated in exactly the areas that are now underwater. The concept of maritime prehistoric cultures has been developed by a number of researchers, including Stephen Oppenheimer in his book Eden in the East, published in 1998, which proposes that the lands now submerged in what is called the Sundaland area, the continental shelf of Southeast Asia that was exposed during the last ice age, was the location of sophisticated cultures that were dispersed by sea level rise and that carried their knowledge, their myths, and their genetic material to the coastal regions of Asia and eventually around the world. The flood myths of South and Southeast Asia, including the Manu tradition in Hinduism and the flood traditions preserved in the mythology of various Southeast Asian cultures, are interpreted in this framework as memories of the inundation of Sundaland. Whether or not the specific Sundaland hypothesis is correct, the broader concept it represents, that Ice Age coastal cultures of significant sophistication were dispersed by sea level rise and carried their knowledge and their memories with them, is a hypothesis that the available evidence from genetics, linguistics, and mythology renders genuinely credible. The alternative, that flood myths from cultures separated by entire oceans arose independently from purely local experiences of flooding, requires accepting a degree of coincidence in the specific structural details of the traditions that becomes harder to sustain the more carefully those details are examined. The genetic evidence has contributed to this picture in ways that the field of population genetics has developed since the early 1990s. The analysis of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA in human populations around the world has produced a picture of human dispersal and migration that does not always match the conventional archaeological model of how people moved around the world and when. Certain genetic signatures are distributed across populations that, on the conventional model, should not share recent common ancestors, suggesting either that the conventional model of migration is incomplete, or that there were population movements and contacts that the conventional model has not accounted for. The linguistic evidence is also relevant, though it is among the most contested forms of evidence in this field. The identification of structural and lexical similarities between languages from geographically distant and conventionally unconnected cultures has been used to argue for ancient contacts that the archaeological record has not documented. These arguments range from well-supported proposals for specific language families and their expansion patterns to more speculative claims about global linguistic connections that professional linguists generally dismiss. As with all the other forms of evidence in this discussion, the quality and rigor of the specific arguments matters enormously. What the accumulation of all this evidence actually supports, taken together and assessed with the intellectual honesty that genuine curiosity requires, rather than with either the enthusiasm of the true believer or the reflexive dismissal of the orthodox skeptic, is the following picture. The period from approximately 15,000 to 8,000 years ago was a period of dramatic environmental change in which the world was transformed, through the end of the Ice Age and the associated events, from one set of physical conditions to a very different set. The human cultures that existed at the beginning of that period were more sophisticated than the conventional model predicted, as demonstrated by Göbekli Tepe and supported by the accumulating evidence from other sites and from the genetic and linguistic record. The most sophisticated of those cultures were almost certainly in the coastal areas that are now submerged, and the physical record of what they achieved is therefore underwater, largely uninvestigated and potentially revealing. The oral traditions that survived the catastrophic changes of that period, preserved through the flood myths and through other mythological traditions, may contain a genuine cultural memory of the world that existed before the waters rose. Within this framework, Plato's Atlantis account occupies a specific place. Whether or not it describes a specific place that existed with the specific geographical and architectural features Plato gives, the account is consistent with the existence of a sophisticated maritime civilization in the period Plato describes, in conditions that would have produced exactly the kind of catastrophic destruction he describes, in a time when the rising seas were indeed covering vast areas of formerly inhabited land. The account may be a highly distorted cultural memory of real events, distorted by thousands of years of oral transmission, and perhaps by Plato's own philosophical elaboration. Or it may be more precise than its critics allow. We do not have enough information to determine which. The haunting quality of the Atlantis question is not the specific claim about a single lost city. It is the broader implication that the world was different before the Ice Age ended, that the people who inhabited it were more sophisticated than we have known, and that the record of their existence lies in the one place we have barely begun to look. The ocean is patient. It has kept its secrets for 12,000 years. The technology that would allow us to search those secrets is, for the first time in human history, within our reach. Plato described, more than 2,000 years ago, a world that had vanished 9,000 years before he wrote, a world that existed when the sea levels were lower and the coastal plains were inhabited, and the cultures of the ancient world were engaged in something that the subsequent catastrophic rearrangement of the planet's surface had buried under the waters. He called what had vanished Atlantis. We call the period the end of the Younger Dryas. The questions are the same. The ocean covers the evidence awaits the looking, and the looking has, at last, barely begun. The specific question of how oral traditions survive over the timescales required by the Atlantis hypothesis is one that deserves careful consideration, because the skeptical objection that no oral tradition could survive 12,000 years in any form recognizable enough to be the basis of Plato's account is a serious objection that requires a serious response. The Australian Aboriginal oral traditions provide the most compelling empirical evidence that oral traditions can preserve accurate information over extremely long timescales. Australian Aboriginal culture has been continuous and geographically stable for at least 50,000 years, and the oral traditions of various Aboriginal groups preserve descriptions of the Australian landscape that can be verified archaeologically and geologically. Several Aboriginal traditions describe specific geological events, including the flooding of specific coastal areas, volcanic eruptions, and other landscape changes that geological dating has confirmed occurred thousands of years ago. In 2015, a study published in the Australian Geographer analysed 18 Aboriginal traditions from coastal areas of Australia and identified 14 of them as describing the specific geographical changes produced by post-glacial sea level rise in the areas where those traditions originated. The traditions describe, in various ways, land that was previously above water and is now below the sea, coastal features that no longer exist in their described form, and other aspects of the landscape that have changed since the Ice Age. The geological dating of the relevant sea level changes in those areas indicates that the traditions are accurately preserving information about events that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. This is not a marginal or anecdotal finding. It is a systematic study demonstrating that oral traditions, in a well-documented continuous cultural context, have preserved accurate geographical information across timescales comparable to those required by the Atlantis hypothesis. If Aboriginal Australian traditions can preserve accurate information about geological events from 12,000 years ago, there is no principled reason why other oral traditions could not have done the same, particularly in cultural contexts where such traditions were given explicit importance as historical records. The Egyptian tradition that Plato describes, in which the priests explicitly positioned themselves as custodians of knowledge that the Greeks had lost through catastrophic disruption, suggests exactly the kind of explicit, institutionally supported preservation of historical tradition that would be most likely to maintain accuracy over long periods. The temple scribes of Egypt were not casual storytellers. They were specialists in the preservation and transmission of knowledge, operating within an institution that had maintained continuity across thousands of years of Egyptian history. If any tradition in the ancient Mediterranean world was capable of preserving genuine historical information from the period of the Ice Age transition, the Egyptian temple tradition would be among the most credible candidates. The specific way that geological and cosmic events are represented in mythological traditions is another area where recent scholarship has produced results that bear on the Atlantis question. The field of archaeoastronomy and the broader field of geomythology, the study of geological events as preserved in mythological tradition, have produced a growing body of evidence that specific mythological narratives encode accurate descriptions of specific geological and astronomical events. The Maori tradition of Mahuika, for example, which describes a being associated with fire who comes down from the sky and causes fire to spread across the earth and to the sea, has been interpreted by researchers as a description of a meteorite impact or cometary event, with the specific fire from the sky motif encoding the visual observation of an impacting object. The Tibetan and Indian traditions of the poisoned sky and darkened sun following great catastrophes encode conditions consistent with volcanic winter or impact winter. The Near Eastern traditions of a great battle among the gods, associated with fire and flood, encode, in the interpretation of some researchers, the cosmic and geological events of the Younger Dryas. None of these interpretations is certain. The translation of specific mythological images into specific geological or astronomical events requires a level of interpretation that introduces uncertainty at every step, and the field of geomythology has produced both compelling analyses and overreached speculations in roughly equal measure. The principle that mythological traditions encode natural phenomena is well established. The interpretation of specific traditions as encoding specific events requires case-by-case evaluation. The Atlantis account in Plato's dialogues can be read through this geomythological lens, and when it is, several features of the account are particularly interesting. The destruction in a single day and night, while conventional interpretation reads this as a narrative device, could encode the observation of a catastrophic event of the kind that produces the transition from a functioning civilization to rubble and ruin in a geological instant, an impact event, or a major seismic event, or an extraordinary flood. The sinking into the sea, which is the central geographical fact of the destruction, as Plato describes it, is consistent with either a tectonic event or a sea level rise, the former more dramatic and the latter more gradual, and the narrative compression of millennia of gradual change into a single event is exactly the kind of transformation that the transmission of an oral tradition over thousands of years would produce. The role of the gods in the account, the divine punishment for hubris, reflects the universal human tendency to attribute natural catastrophes to divine agency, a tendency well documented in the mythological and historical literature of every culture, and does not require us to accept any literal interpretation of divine action in order to treat the underlying description of a catastrophe as potentially encoding a real event. The technological question, the question of what material culture a sophisticated pre-agricultural civilization could have produced and what traces it would have left, is central to the Atlantis debate, because the absence of physical evidence from the period in question has been one of the main arguments against the existence of sophisticated prehistoric cultures. If Atlantis or anything like it existed, the critics ask, where is the physical evidence? The response to this objection has two components. The first is that the physical evidence of any culture is more durable in some forms than others, and that the forms most likely to be found are not necessarily the forms that would survive 12,000 years in the specific conditions of either submergence or the radical environmental changes of the Younger Dryas period. Large stone structures survive best, as Göbekli Tepe demonstrates. The specific materials of Plato's description, metals and wood and plaster and organic materials, would not in general survive 12,000 years, particularly not in conditions of submergence. If Atlantis existed and we found it, we would likely find the stone foundations and the stone tools and little else. The second component of the response is that the objection proves less than it appears to. The absence of physical evidence in areas we have not looked, which is the case for the vast majority of the continental shelves submerged since the Ice Age, is not evidence of absence. It is simply absence of evidence, which is a different and much weaker epistemic state. The physical evidence for Göbekli Tepe was also absent, in the sense of being unknown to science, until 1994. The physical evidence for the Minoan civilization was absent until Arthur Evans began excavating at Knossos in 1900. The physical evidence for the deep water Cretaceous ecosystem was absent until we developed the technology to look for it. In every case, the absence of evidence reflected the limits of our search, rather than the absence of what we were seeking. The limits of our search for pre-flood civilization are very great indeed. The continental shelves of the world's oceans represent one of the largest unexplored archaeological regions on the planet, and the technology to search them systematically is only now becoming available. Autonomous underwater vehicles, high-resolution sonar mapping, improved deep-water excavation techniques, and the growing global network of research vessels capable of conducting systematic surveys are all relatively recent developments, and their application to the question of prehistoric coastal culture is in its very early stages. The specific areas most likely to yield results on the basis of sea level reconstruction and climate modeling are the continental shelves of the major landmasses in the subtropical and temperate zones, the areas that would have been most attractive for human habitation in the Ice Age period and that are now underwater at depths of between 10 and 130 meters. These areas include the North Sea between Britain and continental Europe, which was dry land until approximately 8,000 years ago, and which is known to have been inhabited, as evidenced by the occasional recovery of stone tools and bone material by North Sea fishermen. They include the continental shelves around Southeast Asia, where the Sundaland hypothesis locates a major prehistoric culture. They include the continental shelves of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, which was a river valley rather than a sea for much of the Ice Age period. They include the continental shelves of the Americas, which were larger than the current coastlines by significant margins. The North Sea case is particularly instructive because it is the best documented example of a submerged prehistoric landscape that we know to have been inhabited. Doggerland, the name given to the submerged land of the southern North Sea, was first identified as a potentially significant archaeological region in the early 20th century, when fishermen began recovering animal bones and occasionally human artifacts from the seabed. It has been more systematically studied in recent decades, and what has been established is that it was a substantial land area with river systems, lakes, and coastal zones, inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers for thousands of years before it was gradually submerged by sea level rise between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. Doggerland was not, as far as current evidence shows, a sophisticated civilization of the Atlantis type. It was inhabited by Mesolithic foragers of the kind that conventional archaeology describes for the period. But its existence demonstrates the principle. There was significant habitable land in areas that are now under the North Sea. That land was inhabited, and what it contained is now on the sea floor. The specific cultural level of the Doggerland inhabitants reflects the conventional understanding of the period in that region. The specific cultural level of what might be on the seafloor in other regions, particularly in the areas where the evidence for greater prehistoric sophistication is strongest, is not known. The question of Atlantis, finally, is a question about the limits of human knowledge and about the willingness of human intellectual institutions to revise their models when new evidence demands it. The conventional model of human prehistory has been revised repeatedly across the history of archaeology, sometimes dramatically, as new discoveries have forced the revision of assumptions that were previously regarded as well established. The discovery of the deep antiquity of human presence in Australia, pushing back the date of initial colonization from a few thousand years to more than 50,000 years, required a fundamental revision of the model of human dispersal out of Africa. The discovery of Denisovans and Neanderthals as distinct human species who coexisted and interbred with modern humans required a fundamental revision of the model of human evolution. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe required a fundamental revision of the model of the relationship between social complexity and agriculture. Each of these revisions was resisted initially by the mainstream of the field, because the new evidence conflicted with the established model, and because established models are not abandoned easily by the people and the institutions that have built their professional reputations on them. Each revision eventually prevailed because the evidence was genuine and sufficient, and because the scientific process, however imperfectly and slowly, follows the evidence. The evidence for sophisticated prehistoric culture in the period of the Younger Dryas and the Ice Age transition is not, at present, sufficient to establish the existence of a civilization comparable to Plato's Atlantis description. It is sufficient to establish that conventional model of human prehistory requires significant revision in the direction of greater sophistication at earlier dates, and that the physical record of those earlier and more sophisticated cultures is largely inaccessible in the areas we have not yet searched. The question of Atlantis, in its most defensible form, is not the question of whether a specific island with concentric rings existed in the Atlantic Ocean and sank in a single day and night. It is the question of whether the world that Plato was told about, a world of sophisticated maritime civilization in the period of the great geological transition at the end of the Ice Age, had a historical reality that the subsequent 12,000 years of cultural change and sea level rise has buried under water and under the accumulated mythology of the human traditions that preserved the memory of it. To that question, the honest answer is, we do not know. The evidence that would allow us to know is on the ocean floor. We are only beginning to look at it. And if Plato was right, even approximately, even in the broadest outlines, the search that is beginning will eventually find something that confirms it. Not perhaps the orichalcum and the concentric rings in the precise dimensions that the Critias dialogue specifies, but the remains of a sophisticated coastal culture from the period that Plato described, destroyed by the catastrophic transition that the geological record shows was real, and preserved on the ocean floor in the specific way that stone and bone and the most durable cultural artifacts are preserved when they are covered by water and sediment and left undisturbed for 12,000 years. The ocean has kept its secrets. The technology to read those secrets is arriving. The question that the ocean holds is the question that Plato asked. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the sea that has no shore, the answer waits, patient, submerged, unexcavated, waiting for the day when the searching that has barely begun has progressed far enough to find it, or to confirm its absence, and to give humanity at last the honest answer to the question that a Greek philosopher posed in the 4th century before the Common Era, insisting that it was not an allegory, not a myth, not a philosophical invention, but the truth of what had happened before the waters rose. The waters rose. Something was lost. Whether it was Atlantis is the question the ocean has not yet answered. We have only begun to look.